It was July of 1945. World War II was underway. The USS Indianapolis was sinking. But what happened? Shortly after midnight, a Japanese torpedo hit the Indianapolis in the starboard bow. The impact would blow almost 65 feet of the ship out of the water and igniting a tank containing 3,500 gallons of aviation fuel. The fuel then exploded into a pillar of fire, shooting several hundred feet into the sky. Then another torpedo from the same submarine hit closer to midship, hitting fuel tanks and powder magazines and setting off a chain reaction of explosions that effectively ripped the Indianapolis in two. Still traveling at 17 knots, the Indianapolis began taking on massive amounts of water. The ship sank in just 12 minutes. Of the 1,195 men aboard, 300 went down with the ship and 890 made it into the water alive. Their ordeal, what is considered the worst shark attack in history, was just beginning. USS Indianapolis was a Portland-class heavy cruiser of the United States Navy, named for the city of Indianapolis, Indiana. Launched in 1931, it was the flagship for the commander of Scouting Force 1 for 8 years, then flagship for Admiral Raymond Spruance from 1943 to 1945, while he commanded the Fifth Fleet in battles across the Central Pacific during World War II. In July 1945, Indianapolis completed a top-secret high-speed trip to deliver uranium and other components for Little Boy, the first nuclear weapon ever used in combat, to the Tinian Naval Base. On August 6, 1945, the weapon would level Hiroshima. On July 28th, the Indianapolis sailed from Guam without an escort to meet the battleship USS Idaho in the Leyte Gulf in the Philippines and prepare for an invasion of Japan. The next day was quiet, with the Indianapolis making about 17 knots through swells of 5 or 6 feet in the seemingly endless Pacific. As the sun set over the ship, the sailors played cards and read books, keeping themselves from the boredom that would come with the life at sea. Suddenly, a loud sound filled the once quiet night sky. The sailors, confused, had no idea what had just happened. Then, moments later, a second sound just like the first. The confusion was now a nightmare. They were sinking. 12 minutes later, the USS Indianapolis was gone. 890 souls were now in the water. As the sun rose on July 30th, the survivors bobbed in the water. Life rafts were scarce. The living searched for the dead floating in the water and appropriated their life jackets for survivors who had none. Hoping to keep some semblance of order, survivors began forming groups, some small, some over 300, in the open water. Soon they would be staving off exposure, thirst, and if that wasn't enough, sharks. The sharks were drawn by the sound of the explosions, the sinking of the ship, and the thrashing and blood in the water. But the sound didn't just attract just any shark. They were whitetips. Though many species of shark that live in the open water, none is considered as aggressive as the oceanic whitetip. Reports from the Indianapolis survivors indicate that the sharks tended to attack live victims close to the surface, leading historians to believe that most of the shark-related fatalities came from oceanic whitetips. The first night, the sharks focused on the floating dead, but the survivors' struggles in the water only attracted more and more sharks, which could feel their motions through a biological feature known as lateral lines. Lateral lines are receptors along their bodies that pick up changes in pressure and movement from hundreds of yards away. As the sharks turned their attentions toward the living, especially the injured and the bleeding, sailors tried to quarantine themselves away from anyone with an open wound. When someone died, they would push the body away, hoping to sacrifice the corpse in return, saving themselves from a shark's jaw. Many survivors were paralyzed with fear, unable even to eat or drink from the meager rations they had salvaged from their ship. One group of survivors made the mistake of opening a can of Spam, but before they could taste it, the scent of the meat drew a swarm of sharks around them. Other groups could only listen as they heard the sounds of the sharks devouring and pulling their crewmates under the water. The sharks fed for days with no sign of rescue for the men. Navy intelligence had intercepted a message from the Japanese submarine that had torpedoed the Indianapolis, describing how it had sunk an American battleship along the Indianapolis's route. But the message was disregarded as a trick to lure American rescue boats into an ambush. In the meantime, the Indianapolis survivors learned that they had the best odds in a group, and ideally in the center of the group. The men on the margins, or worse, alone, were the most susceptible to the sharks. As the days passed, many survivors succumbed to heat and thirst, or suffered hallucinations that compelled them to drink the seawater around them, a sentence of death by salt poisoning. Those who so slaked their thirst would slip into madness, foaming at the mouth as their tongues and lips swelled. They often became as great a threat to the survivors as the sharks circling below. Many dragged their comrades underwater with them as they died. After 11 a.m. on their fourth day in the water, a Navy plane flying overhead spotted the Indianapolis survivors and radioed for help. Within hours, another seaplane, manned by Lieutenant Adrian Marks, returned to the scene and dropped rafts and survival supplies. When Marks saw men being attacked by sharks, he disobeyed orders and landed in the infested waters, and then began taxiing his plane to help the wounded and stragglers, who were at the greatest risk. A little after midnight, the USS Doyle arrived on the scene and helped to pull the last survivors from the water. Of the Indianapolis original 196-man crew, only 317 remained. Estimates of the numbers who died from shark attacks range from a few dozen to almost 150. It's impossible to be sure, but either way, the ordeal of the Indianapolis survivors remains the worst maritime disaster in U.S. naval history. Thanks for watching.